Hi, I'm Pastor Matt Lenahan from Zion Lutheran in Akron, Pennsylvania, a member of the Lower Susquehanna Synod's racial justice team, and happy to be part of this virtual workshop experience. I have here something that has been really helpful to me over this last year. It's a calendar put out by the Equal Justice Initiative, the work of activist and author and lawyer Bryan Stevenson. The Equal Justice Initiative has put out a calendar of a history of racial injustice. And for every day of the calendar year, sadly but true, there is some aspect of racial justice and injustice in American history that we can read about. Admittedly, I confess to you, as I have read through this calendar in the past year, I have discovered many, many gaps in my knowledge of American history, the history of race, racism, and anti-racism in our country. I don't fault the education system in which I was raised. I think that systemically it proves the very issue to which we are addressing ourselves as people of faith here and now in this series of workshops. And that is that the history of race, racism, and anti-racism in our country is itself clouded in that history and in the movement of white supremacy that basically gets to tell the story of American history from a certain point of view, leaving out the perspective of black and brown people. Writer and activist and anti-racist James Baldwin said, "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." One of the key movements toward racial justice and becoming an anti-racist church is to re-examine and understand the history of racism, racist ideas, and racialized violence that has shaped the United States. From its founding documents, we experience the deep contradictions existing here. How can a nation founded on the premise of individual liberty and justice for all, a democracy in which all men are created equal and are endowed with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, also deny those rights and that liberty and that equality to indigenous peoples and people of African descent? How do the founders of this nation understand the contradiction in which they enslaved African peoples and at the same time rebelled against colonial powers to assert their own freedom? How does the color of one's skin become the dividing line of injustice and inequity and cruelty we have inherited? From the doctrine of discovery and chattel slavery to Jim Crow segregation and racist brutality, we know that race has and continues to divide us. We may condemn these parts of our history or deny our own participation, but the truth is we are all condemned by the consumption of racist ideas. The idea of race was constructed to benefit and enrich white landowners, to build the fledgling American economy on the backs of enslaved labor, and to advance the idea of white superiority and black inferiority. American history is racially constructed to advance white superiority and black inferiority. In many ways, American history is a history of racism as an integral aspect of our national charter. So much of the history we're taught in American schools denies or ignores the history of race and racism. We don't wrestle with the contradictions between our founding documents and the many laws that institutionalized the lifelong enslavement of African people. We do not reflect on the contradictions existing in the lives of Jefferson or Washington or other founders who declared independence and maintained the institution of slavery, embedding racist ideas in the U.S. Constitution, like the 3/5 clause that denies people of African descent their humanity. This was undergirded by both biblical theology and new science that sought to justify the enslavement and bitter cruelty that whites placed on people of African descent. Polygenesis suggested that Africans were an inferior race because they were subhuman, not of the same species as white people. Monogenesis suggested that Africans were human but inferior intellectually or socially. The curse of Ham or the curse of Canaan was an idea from the book of Genesis suggesting that God had cursed black bodies to be enslaved to whites. Science was developing around evolution of species, and race became a category to define human evolution, with the idea that blacks were the least evolved and whites the most evolved in the hierarchy of race. We don't hear the stories of slave rebellion and resistance like the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1845. We don't hear about the Great Migration that brought 6 million African Americans freed by the 13th Amendment out of the harshness of the economic and social conditions of the post-Civil War South to the north, populating urban centers, leading to white flight and redlining and black ghettos. We don't learn about the Tulsa riots or the Chicago race riots or the Red Summer of 1919. We don't talk about thousands of lynchings or the laws that protected white lynchers from prosecution. I majored in American history in college and am still surprised at all of the gaps in U.S. history, the history of race and racism that I continue to learn. Most of our history is taught with a sanitized view of slavery and racism. Our history acknowledges the problem of slavery from an economic and political perspective, but not from a human rights perspective. I was never once taught, for example, that chattel slavery was wrong, unjust, criminal, or that our society needed to make amends for such atrocities. From Lincoln and the Civil War to King and civil rights, the great emancipator and the great nonviolent marcher, we were taught that we were making racial progress over time. Building a timeline of racial history in the U.S. allows us to realize the extent to which racism and racist ideas have indeed shaped our identity as American citizens. And as people of faith, we also confess our own complicity in and our indifference toward racial and racist history. Here we will consider a few points of reference on the journey toward anti-racism. From 1619 and the arrival of enslaved Africans in Jamestown Colony through the Revolutionary War period and the 19th century, racist ideas that supported slavery developed alongside ideas about liberty and justice for whites. Early laws in Virginia separated black and white servants, embedding the racial divide to advance white supremacy. Alongside racist ideas, abolitionism and racial equality also existed. As early as 1688, Quakers in the United States signed the first written protests of slavery in America, not far from where I lead a faith community here in central Pennsylvania. In 1700, there were about 6,000 slaves in Virginia. By 1763, there were 170,000, or half the population. And by the eve of the Civil War, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people of African descent. In 1793, the Southern economy was strengthened by the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, an invention that supported a growing slave economy in the South. And the Fugitive Slave Act made aiding runaway slaves a federal crime that same year. There were Supreme Court cases, like the Dred Scott decision in 1857, that deepened the divide between slaveholding states and free states, abolitionism and chattel slavery. And then there was secessionism. Beginning in 1861, 11 southern states seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the CSA, made it clear in his cornerstone speech in March of 1861 on the eve of the Civil War that the issue of slavery and black inferiority was the very heart and center of secession. He said, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development, like all the other truths in the various departments of science." We talk about the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, but we don't realize or talk about Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, when African American peoples in Texas were finally informed that they had been emancipated several years earlier. That date, Juneteenth, is now celebrated across the country as the day of emancipation. Between 1869 and 1872, there were new amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, passed to abolish slavery or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. And so the 13th Amendment, though abolishing slavery, ostensibly makes being a black body also potentially illegal. And there would be many ways in which white supremacists would make being black illegal in and of itself. You've heard it said that people are considered illegal for driving while black, walking while black, being in their own home while black. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship for former slaves and all born in the U.S., guaranteeing equal protection under the law for all citizens. And the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote, that it shall not be denied based on race or color or previous slavery. After radical Reconstruction, which only lasted 13 years, from 1865 and 1877, during which time freed African American slaves, freed slaves were offered 40 acres and a mule. They were given the right to vote and even received state seats in Congress. 16 African Americans served in U.S. Congress during that short period of time. Over 2,000 blacks, many former slaves, served in state and local seats of government. But then there emerged black codes, oppressive laws established in the southern states to restrict labor, to disenfranchise and limit black freedoms. In South Carolina, a law prohibited blacks from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax. This provision hit free blacks already living in Charleston and former slave artisans especially hard. And the Ku Klux Klan intimidated and murdered black citizens in the South. 35 African American officials were killed by the Klan during Reconstruction alone. In 1896, the Supreme Court upheld separate but equal laws known as the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Homer Plessy agreed to be the plaintiff and refused to ride in a blacks-only train car. Once U.S. troops had pulled out of the southern states in 1877, ostensibly ending Reconstruction, these Jim Crow laws or black codes emerged to segregate freed African Americans and whites. And one of the first ways segregation took shape was on railroads and public transit. Florida was the first state to pass a law that segregated railroad cars for Negroes or colored passengers and white passengers. In June of 1892, Homer Plessy bought a train ticket and sat in the whites-only car and refused to move. He was arrested and convicted. He petitioned the court claiming that his 14th Amendment rights were violated. But the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment applied to civil and voting rights, but not to social rights, like riding in the railroad, thus upholding separate but equal, which really meant separate and unequal in so many different ways. These black codes, or oppressive Jim Crow laws, led to the Great Migration. Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million people of African descent, Southern blacks, migrated north in an attempt to escape oppression and find better work. But during this same time, there was also significant racial violence and racist oppression that made it difficult for African Americans to travel, to leave the South, to move north, to find places of residence in the North, to acquire gainful employment in the North, and to have humane working conditions when they arrived there. In 1919, the Red Summer broke out, a summer of racial violence, over 83 lynchings, white rage, and urban riots north and south. In our workshops, we spend time creating a timeline of racial and racist history, recognizing the gaps in our knowledge and understanding. The first step toward a larger worldview is to humbly acknowledge one's ignorance. So I invite you to begin an exploration of our history as it pertains to race and racism and anti-racism. Check out the resources on our website or shared with you digitally, and pursue this learning. This is a critical part of our transformational work. Read books like Stamped from the Beginning, A History of Racist Ideas by Ibram X. Kendi, or White Rage by Carol Anderson, or The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. We are reminded that it is to our history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And so if our aspirations lead us hopefully to become anti-racist allies for racial justice, then we must look closely at our history, understand its failures, so that we can learn and grow and change.